August 26, 1944. A convoy stretches 48 miles along French highways. 6,000 trucks rolling bumper to bumper from Normandy beaches to the front lines near Chartres. German reconnaissance pilots photograph the spectacle from high altitude, certain they've discovered a catastrophic traffic jam that will cripple the Allied advance. Instead, they've witnessed the birth of the largest ground supply operation in military history. The Red Ball Express. A logistical miracle that General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach dismisses in his situation report that evening as typical British disorganization on an American scale. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Eberbach commands what remains of Panzer Group West after the Falaise Gap disaster. His intelligence officers show him aerial photographs of the endless truck columns snaking across liberated France. The general studies the images with professional contempt. He calculates fuel consumption, maintenance requirements, driver fatigue, traffic control challenges. His conclusion appears in the war diary maintained by his operations officer. The Anglo-American supply system has overextended itself catastrophically. Their forward elements will grind to a halt within 72 hours when this chaotic motor pool exhausts itself. 3 weeks later, British Second Army under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery launches Operation Market Garden with fuel reserves exceeding initial planning estimates. The trucks never stopped rolling. The mathematics of modern warfare in August 1944 presented Allied planners with an impossible equation. General Omar Bradley's First Army advancing eastward from Normandy required 400 tons of supplies daily. Montgomery's British and Canadian forces consumed 350 tons. General George Patton's Third Army, slicing through Brittany and wheeling toward the German border, devoured 800 tons every 24 hours. Total daily requirement, 1,500 tons minimum, 2,200 tons optimal, delivered across 200 miles of French countryside where every bridge lay demolished and every railroad yard sat destroyed by years of strategic bombing followed by German demolition teams during their retreat. The port facilities that should have sustained this advance remained unusable. Cherbourg captured on June 27 but so thoroughly sabotaged that Allied engineers estimated 3 months before significant cargo operations could resume. The artificial mulberry harbors off the invasion beaches handled impressive tonnage but geography limited their reach. Supplies arriving at Omaha Beach faced a 240-mile journey to forward units near the Seine. Utah Beach sat even farther from the rapidly advancing front lines. German planners had anticipated this crisis. Their pre-war studies of Western European logistics calculated that Allied forces could not sustain major operations more than 100 kilometers inland from coastal ports. The assessment proved accurate during the Great War when British and French armies required years to push German forces back across territory they now liberated in weeks. Wehrmacht strategists assumed modern mechanization would intensify rather than solve these supply problems. Tanks consumed fuel at rates unimaginable in 1918. Motorized infantry required constant spare parts. Artillery ammunition expenditures had increased tenfold since the previous conflict. Oberst Friedrich von Schell, German Army logistics specialist, published a study in 1942 examining Allied supply capabilities. His analysis became required reading at Wehrmacht staff colleges. Von Schell calculated that American and British forces lacked sufficient transport vehicles to support sustained offensive operations in continental Europe. Even if the Allies somehow landed successfully in France, their advance would stall when extended supply lines exceeded organic transport capacity. The mathematics appeared irrefutable. German intelligence estimated Allied truck strength at approximately 40,000 vehicles for the entire European theater. Von Schell's formula required minimum 80,000 trucks to sustain the advance Allied propaganda claimed possible. The formula failed to account for American industrial capacity and improvisational logistics planning. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee commanded Communications Zone, the vast rear area organization responsible for supplying Allied forces in Europe. A career logistics officer, Lee understood that conventional supply doctrine could not support the rapid exploitation Bradley and Patton demanded. Normal procedure called for methodical advance with supply dumps established at regular intervals, railroad reconstruction keeping pace with forward movement, port facilities captured and restored before major inland operations commenced. None of these conditions existed in August 1944. Allied armies raced eastward faster than engineers could rebuild rail lines. Port engineers struggled with German sabotage that exceeded worst-case planning estimates. Supply dumps existed only on Normandy beaches, growing farther from combat units with each passing day. Lee faced a choice between adhering to established doctrine, which meant halting the advance until infrastructure caught up with ambition, or improvising a solution that textbooks insisted was impossible. He chose improvisation on a scale that made German logistics officers question Allied sanity when they learned the details after the war. The Red Ball Express received its name from railroad terminology. American freight companies marked priority shipments with red balls to ensure expedited handling. Lee adopted the designation for a dedicated truck route running from Saint-Lô through Alsace and Chartres toward Paris and beyond. The route operated under special regulations that suspended normal traffic control. No vehicle except red ball trucks permitted on designated highways. No stops except for emergency repairs. No speed limits. No rest requirements beyond minimum safety standards. Drivers pushed their vehicles 18 to 20 hours daily, sustained by benzodrine tablets distributed by medical officers who understood that exhaustion posed less immediate danger than halted armies running dry of ammunition. The operation began officially on August 25, 1944, though preliminary convoys had been running for several days as Lee assembled the necessary resources. The scale shocked even American officers accustomed to their nation's industrial output. 5,900 vehicles initially, growing to over 6,000 within a week. Deuce-and-a-half trucks, the workhorse GMC CCKW that became synonymous with American logistics. Each truck carried 5 tons of cargo. 2 round trips weekly meant each vehicle delivered 10 tons to forward supply points. 6,000 trucks making 2 trips delivered 120,000 tons weekly, exceeding the combined capacity of Cherbourg and the Mulberry harbors operating at theoretical maximum efficiency. The statistics represented more than numbers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Each truck required a driver, often 2 for continuous operations. Maintenance crews worked around the clock keeping vehicles operational. Traffic control points staffed by military police directed the endless stream of canvas-covered trucks along routes marked with red balls painted on telephone poles, trees, buildings, anything visible to drivers pushing through darkness and weather. Fuel dumps every 50 miles ensured trucks never ran dry. Medical stations treated drivers for exhaustion, minor injuries, stimulant side effects. The entire system functioned as a vast machine consuming resources to deliver resources, a logistical paradox that somehow generated net positive results. German intelligence officers monitoring the operation from concealed observation posts reported their findings with incredulity that translated poorly in official communications. Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, intelligence officer with 5th Panzer Army, submitted a report on September 3 describing red ball operations he observed near Reims. His language struggled to convey the reality. The enemy transport columns operate continuously without apparent regard for vehicle maintenance cycles, driver rest requirements, or traffic control procedures. Individual trucks appear poorly maintained by German standards, yet the system functions through sheer numerical superiority. For every vehicle that breaks down, 3 more continue forward. Disabled trucks are pushed aside and left for recovery teams while the convoy maintains speed and schedule. Dietrich's superiors question his assessment. The described operation violated every principle of German logistics doctrine. Vehicles required scheduled maintenance or they failed catastrophically. Drivers needed rest or they caused accidents. Traffic required strict control or congestion paralyzed movement. Yet the Americans somehow ignored these axioms and achieved results German quartermasters considered impossible. The explanation lay in fundamental philosophical differences between German and American approaches to logistics. German doctrine emphasized efficiency through precise planning and strict adherence to maintenance schedules. Every vehicle received regular servicing whether it showed problems or not. Drivers operated in shifts with mandated rest periods. Traffic moved according to carefully calculated timetables that minimized congestion through central coordination. This system worked brilliantly when conditions matched planning assumptions. German logistics supported the Wehrmacht's stunning victories from 1939 through 1942. But the system proved brittle when reality diverged from plans. Unexpected delays cascaded through the entire network. Vehicle breakdowns disrupted carefully coordinated schedules. The requirement for regular maintenance meant significant portions of any motor pool sat idle undergoing preventive service. American logistics accepted chaos as inevitable and planned accordingly. Trucks received minimal maintenance and ran until they broke. The U.S. industrial base produced vehicles faster than combat could destroy them, so mechanical casualties were simply replaced rather than repaired. Drivers pushed themselves to exhaustion because replacement drivers stood ready when the first crew collapsed. Traffic control accepted that some congestion was unavoidable and worked around problems rather than preventing them through rigid scheduling. The result looked disorganized to German observers trained in precise staff work. In reality, the apparent chaos masked sophisticated understanding of system redundancy and statistical probability. Not every truck needed to complete every mission. The system only required that enough trucks delivered enough supplies to sustain operations. American planners calculated acceptable loss rates and built sufficient overcapacity to absorb those losses while meeting delivery targets. Red Ball Express operated on these principles from its inception. Lee and his staff knew that trucks would break down, drivers would crash from exhaustion, traffic jams would develop despite dedicated routes. They planned for these failures by assigning more trucks than theoretical calculations required. When the inevitable problems occurred, the excess capacity absorbed them without shutting down the entire operation. The tonnage figures told the story. Red Ball Express delivered 412,193 tons of supplies between August 25 and November 16, 1944, when improving railroad service in captured ports allowed the system to stand down. That figure exceeded the combined output of all French Atlantic ports during the same period. It represented more cargo than passed through the port of New York during an average month before the war. The trucks moved enough ammunition to sustain continuous artillery bombardment across the entire Western Front. They delivered sufficient fuel to keep thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of vehicles mobile despite consumption rates that would have bankrupted small nations in peacetime. Montgomery's forces received priority allocations during late August and early September as Market Garden approached. British Second Army required stockpiling of fuel, ammunition, and supplies sufficient for a rapid thrust into the Netherlands. Red Ball trucks diverted from other routes concentrated deliveries to British supply dumps around Brussels and Eindhoven. The concentration stripped other sectors, leaving Patton's Third Army temporarily immobilized for lack of gasoline, but it gave Montgomery the logistics foundation his operation demanded. German intelligence observed this shift with satisfaction. Their analysis suggested the Allies were robbing Peter to pay Paul, concentrating resources for one offensive while weakening others. This appeared to confirm assessments that Allied logistics remained fundamentally inadequate despite impressive truck numbers. General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel before the latter's forced suicide, noted in his memoirs that German commanders expected Market Garden to outrun its supply lines regardless of preliminary stockpiling. The British tendency toward methodical operations suggested they would halt and consolidate when difficulties emerged rather than pushing forward into potential logistical collapse. The assessment misunderstood both Montgomery's intentions and the Red Ball system's flexibility. Market Garden required rapid exploitation, not methodical advance. Montgomery planned to seize bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem through airborne assault, then rush ground forces up a single highway to link the isolated paratroopers before German reinforcements could destroy them. The operation demanded speed and continuous momentum. Logistics needed to support that tempo without the careful preparation German doctrine required. Red Ball Express adapted to these requirements by modifying routes and priorities with minimal advance notice. Trucks scheduled for Paris switched to Brussels. Convoys heading toward Third Army dumps redirected to British supply points. The system's apparent disorganization became its greatest strength. There was no rigid timetable to revise, no carefully coordinated schedule to rebuild. Dispatchers simply sent trucks wherever immediate need appeared greatest, trusting that overall tonnage would meet aggregate demand even if individual units sometimes ran short temporarily. This flexibility mystified German planners accustomed to logistics systems that required weeks of preparation for major operational shifts. Oberst Bogislaw von Bohnen, operations officer at OKW, studied Red Ball operations after the war while imprisoned by the Americans. His analysis identified the fundamental difference between German and Allied logistics philosophy. We sought efficiency through organization and planning. The Americans achieved effectiveness through redundancy and adaptability. Our system worked better when everything functioned as designed. Their system worked better when nothing functioned as designed, because they assumed chaos and built accordingly. The human dimension of Red Ball Express challenged German assumptions about American military effectiveness. Approximately 75% of Red Ball drivers came from African American quartermaster truck companies. The U.S. Army's segregation policies concentrated black soldiers in service units rather than combat roles. Red Ball became the largest operation manned predominantly by troops that many white officers considered unsuited for positions requiring initiative and responsibility. The performance of these drivers demolished racist assumptions among Allied commanders who bothered to notice, though it had minimal impact on official segregation policies that continued throughout the war. Red Ball drivers navigated unfamiliar terrain under blackout conditions while exhausted from marathon driving shifts. They maintained vehicles with minimal mechanical training using improvised tools and scrounged parts. They dealt with blown tires, engine failures, and combat damage while deep in potentially hostile territory where bypassed German units still operated. The accident and breakdown rates remained remarkably low given the operating conditions. Drivers developed informal maintenance networks, helping each other with repairs, sharing parts and tools, teaching mechanical skills to newcomers. The esprit de corps became legendary. Red Ball drivers took pride in their mission, understanding that forward units depended on their deliveries. When trucks broke down beyond field repair capability, drivers often hitchhiked back to depots, collected replacement vehicles, and returned to the route without waiting for official orders. This initiative bewildered German intelligence officers who interrogated captured Red Ball drivers. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed that service troops required close supervision and detailed orders. The idea that truck drivers would independently solve problems and resume operations without explicit authorization contradicted everything German military culture taught about enlisted personnel. Yet the interrogation reports confirmed that Red Ball functioned through exactly this kind of decentralized initiative. Private First Class Roosevelt Williams exemplified the Red Ball driver. A former sharecropper from Mississippi, Williams had minimal formal education and no mechanical training before the Army drafted him in 1943. He received 6 weeks of truck driving instruction, sufficient to operate the vehicle but inadequate for serious repairs. Assigned to the 3,348th Quartermaster Truck Company, Williams found himself driving the Saint-Lô to Paris route in late August 1944, just weeks after arriving in France. His daily routine involved loading 5 tons of ammunition or fuel at the Normandy beach dumps, driving 240 miles to forward supply points near Paris, unloading, and returning for another load. The round trip took between 20 and 24 hours depending on traffic, weather, and mechanical problems. Williams drove with a partner, alternating at the wheel while the other tried to sleep in the passenger seat or the cargo bed. Benzedrine tablets kept them alert during the periods when sleep proved impossible despite exhaustion. The truck Williams drove, a GMC CCKW built in 1943, developed chronic electrical problems that caused intermittent engine stalling. Williams lacked the knowledge to repair the fault properly, but he discovered that beating the starter solenoid with a tire iron usually restored function temporarily. This solution violated every maintenance regulation, but it kept the truck mobile when proper repair would have required days in a motor pool. Williams drove that truck for 6 weeks, delivering over 300 tons of supplies while accumulating a maintenance record that would have horrified German logistics officers trained to treat vehicles as precision instruments requiring expert care. German prisoners working at Allied supply dumps observed these operations with confusion that sometimes bordered on admiration. Gefreiter Helmut Schneider, captured at Falaise, spent September 1944 loading trucks at a fuel dump near Alassa. His assignment brought him into daily contact with Red Ball drivers who impressed him despite his initial prejudices. Schneider had absorbed standard Wehrmacht propaganda about American inefficiency and lack of military spirit. The reality challenged those assumptions in ways that forced uncomfortable reconsideration of everything he thought he knew about his enemies. Schneider worked 12-hour shifts alongside American soldiers who treated him with casual indifference rather than the hostility he expected. The Red Ball drivers arriving for fuel loads moved with purposeful urgency that reminded him of German combat troops before an offensive, not the relaxed attitude he associated with rear echelon personnel. These men understood their mission mattered. They took pride in delivery statistics the way infantry boasted about objectives captured. When trucks broke down at the fuel point, other drivers stopped to help with repairs, sharing tools and expertise without waiting for orders from superiors. The racial dynamics puzzled Schneider most profoundly. Wehrmacht propaganda portrayed Americans as divided by racial hatred that weakened their military effectiveness. Schneider expected to see black soldiers treated as inferiors by white officers, perhaps even abused or humiliated. Instead, he observed a complex reality that defied simple categorization. Segregation clearly existed. Black drivers belonged to separate units, lived in separate quarters, faced restrictions and prejudices that white soldiers avoided. Yet within the Red Ball operation itself, racial boundaries seemed to matter less than mission accomplishment. White military police directing traffic treated black drivers with the same brusque efficiency they showed everyone. White mechanics at maintenance points worked alongside black drivers to repair vehicles. The fuel dump commander, a white captain, knew many drivers by name and asked about their routes, their loads, their vehicle conditions. Schneider mentioned these observations in a letter home that Allied censors allowed to pass through Red Cross channels. His family in Saxony found his descriptions nearly incomprehensible. The racial theories that saturated German education and propaganda for over a decade had taught them that multiracial armies could not function effectively. American military success despite maintaining a segregated force structure challenged those assumptions in ways that required either dismissing the evidence or reconsidering the theories. Schneider chose reconsideration, though he kept those thoughts private while still in captivity. The maintenance challenges facing Red Ball operations would have crippled a less adaptable system. GMC trucks rolling off Detroit assembly lines in 1943 were designed for reliability rather than longevity. The Army's procurement strategy assumed that vehicles would be used hard and replaced frequently rather than maintained indefinitely. This approach horrified German logistics officers who calculated that proper vehicle maintenance required rotating significant portions of any motor pool through workshops for preventive service. American quartermasters simply ran trucks until they broke, then either repaired them quickly or replaced them with new vehicles arriving in steady streams from stateside production lines. Red Ball maintenance procedures reflected this philosophy. Trucks received fuel, oil, and tire checks at each turnaround, but little else unless obvious problems appeared. Drivers reported mechanical issues to dispatchers who decided whether vehicles needed immediate workshop attention or could continue operating until scheduled rotation. Many trucks ran for weeks with minor defects that German regulations would have required immediate repair. Transmissions that slipped gears, clutches that dragged, brakes that pulled to one side, all operated in Red Ball service as long as drivers could compensate for the problems. Mobile maintenance teams followed the truck routes, stopping at breakdown sites to attempt field repairs. These teams operated from trucks equipped with welding equipment, spare parts, and tools sufficient for most common failures. A skilled mechanic could replace a blown engine in under 6 hours using a spare power plant carried on the maintenance truck. Transmission swaps took similar time. The maintenance philosophy emphasized speed over perfection. Repairs needed to get trucks moving again, not restore them to factory specifications. Sergeant Technical Grade 3 Marcus Henderson commanded one of these mobile maintenance teams attached to the 582nd Quartermaster Truck Battalion. A former garage mechanic from Detroit, Henderson enlisted in 1942 and received assignment to quartermaster service based on his civilian skills. His team consisted of 4 other mechanics, all black soldiers with varying levels of automotive experience. They worked from a modified GMC truck carrying an impressive array of parts, tools, and equipment accumulated through official channels and creative scrounging. Henderson's team typically handled 8 to 12 breakdowns during each 24-hour period. Engine failures constituted the most common serious problem, usually caused by overheating from sustained high-speed operation or oil starvation when drivers pushed too long between checks. Henderson and his crew developed procedures that reduced engine replacement time from the manual's estimated 8 hours to under 4. They prepositioned spare engines at strategic points along the route, eliminating transport delays. They fabricated specialized tools that simplified removal of burned-out power plants. They streamlined the replacement process by eliminating steps they deemed unnecessary for field conditions. The results kept trucks rolling at rates that astonished British liaison officers accustomed to more methodical maintenance practices. Captain Nigel Hartwell of the Royal Army Service Corps spent a week observing red ball operations in early September as part of a study on American logistics methods. His report to British Second Army Headquarters expressed qualified admiration mixed with professional skepticism about long-term sustainability. The American approach achieves impressive short-term results through intensive use of material resources. Vehicle serviceability rates appear lower than British standards would accept, yet operational availability remains high due to numerical superiority. Whether this system could function in a resource-constrained environment remains questionable. Hartwell identified a fundamental difference between British and American logistics philosophy. British forces maintained higher vehicle serviceability through stricter maintenance discipline and lower operational tempo. American forces accepted lower serviceability but maintained higher operational tempo through sheer numbers. If the British had 80 trucks with 90% serviceability, 72 vehicles were available for operations. If the Americans had 120 trucks with 70% serviceability, 84 vehicles were available despite the lower maintenance standards. The mathematics favored the American approach as long as industrial production could sustain the required vehicle strength. German intelligence officers eventually recognized this distinction after months of confusion about American logistics capabilities. A detailed analysis prepared by Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Logistics Section in October 1944 concluded that American military effectiveness stemmed not from superior organization or tactical skill but from overwhelming material superiority that rendered traditional efficiency metrics meaningless. The report noted with barely concealed frustration that American forces could afford to waste resources on a scale that would bankrupt any European power. The observation contained truth but missed the deeper point. American logistics planners did not waste resources through ignorance or carelessness. They made deliberate choices to prioritize operational effectiveness over material efficiency. Running trucks until they broke and replacing them proved cheaper in the context of American industrial capacity than maintaining those trucks to German standards of mechanical perfection. The maintenance man-hours saved by accepting higher mechanical failure rates could be redirected to other tasks. The operational flexibility gained by not constraining tempo to preserve equipment enabled exploitation of tactical opportunities that more conservative approaches would miss. Red Ball Express embodied this philosophy in its most extreme form. The system consumed trucks, tires, engines, and spare parts at prodigious rates. Fuel usage exceeded theoretical calculations because drivers ran engines at high RPM to maintain speed on French highways never designed for heavy truck traffic. Tires were accelerated beyond normal expectations due to overloading and sustained operation on roads damaged by years of war. Engine failures occurred more frequently than peacetime standards would tolerate because preventive maintenance took second priority to keeping trucks moving. Yet the system worked. Supplies reached forward units in quantities sufficient to sustain offensive operations across a front that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Montgomery received the stockpiles he needed for Market Garden. Patton got enough fuel to keep Third Army mobile despite bitter complaints that he deserved more. Bradley's First Army maintained pressure on German defenses without pause for logistical reorganization. The entire Allied advance from Normandy to the German border occurred on a timeline that German planners had calculated was impossible given available port capacity and transportation infrastructure. The human cost of Red Ball operations rarely appeared in official histories focused on tonnage statistics and delivery schedules. Drivers pushed themselves beyond normal endurance limits day after day, sustained by amphetamines that provided alertness at the expense of health. Accident rates climbed as exhaustion degraded judgment and reflexes. Trucks rolled off roads, collided with other vehicles, struck obstacles that alert drivers would have avoided. Some accidents resulted from mechanical failures, but most stemmed from driver fatigue that no amount of chemical stimulation could fully counter. Private Eugene Baker died on September 8, 1944, when his truck left the road near Dreux and overturned in a drainage ditch. The accident investigation found no mechanical defect. Baker had been driving for 19 consecutive hours after his relief driver fell ill and returned to base. Benzedrine tablets kept him alert enough to maintain speed but not alert enough to navigate safely when the road curved sharply. The truck carried 5 tons of artillery ammunition. Baker's body was recovered from the wreckage and buried at the American cemetery in Normandy alongside thousands of other soldiers who died in France that year. Baker's death represented one of hundreds that occurred during Red Ball operations. Exact figures remain uncertain because official casualty reports did not always distinguish between combat deaths and accidents, especially for service troops operating near forward areas where enemy action remained possible. Conservative estimates suggest at least 300 deaths directly attributable to Red Ball accidents between August and November 1944. Hundreds more suffered serious injuries that ended their military service or left permanent disabilities. These casualties received little attention compared to infantry losses, yet they represented genuine sacrifice in service of a mission that proved as vital as any combat operation. Without Red Ball drivers willing to push themselves to exhaustion and beyond, the Allied advance stalls somewhere between Normandy and Paris. German forces gained time to establish stronger defensive positions. The war in Europe potentially extends into 1946 with all the additional casualties that delay would entail. Baker and the other men who died keeping trucks rolling contributed to victory as surely as soldiers who stormed beaches or seized bridges under fire. The operational tempo placed extraordinary demands not just on drivers but on the entire support structure. Fuel dumps operated around the clock to service the endless truck convoys. Workers manhandled 55-gallon drums of gasoline, diesel, and oil, filling truck tanks as quickly as possible to minimize turnaround time. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Fuel vapors caused headaches, nausea, and respiratory problems. Spills created fire hazards. Static electricity could ignite fumes with catastrophic results. Yet the dumps maintained operations without pause because halting them meant halting the trucks, which meant halting the armies. Supply dumps at the delivery end of Red Ball routes faced similar pressures. Arriving trucks needed unloading immediately so drivers could begin the return journey. Ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, all required sorting and distribution to forward units. The dumps operated with minimal security because everyone available worked at moving cargo. German infiltrators could have caused tremendous damage had they recognized the vulnerability, but Allied counterintelligence and the rapid pace of German retreat prevented exploitation of these weaknesses. Traffic control represented another constant challenge. 6,000 trucks moving along designated routes required coordination that taxed available military police resources. Control points at major intersections directed traffic, resolved jams, rerouted convoys around accidents or roadblocks. MPs worked 12-hour shifts directing endless streams of trucks through day and night, maintaining flow despite the chaos inherent in moving such massive volumes of vehicles through areas still recovering from combat. Corporal James Mitchell commanded a traffic control point at the intersection of routes 23 and 138 south of Paris. His position handled an average of 400 trucks daily during peak Red Ball operations. Mitchell and his three-man team directed traffic with hand signals, whistles, and occasional profanity when drivers ignored instructions. They dealt with breakdowns blocking intersections, lost drivers seeking directions, French civilian vehicles attempting to use roads reserved for military traffic, and the general confusion of moving an army's worth of supplies through infrastructure designed for peacetime commerce. The stress of the work manifested in various ways. Some MPs became short-tempered, screaming at drivers over minor infractions. Others grew cynical, no longer caring whether traffic flowed smoothly as long as their shift ended on schedule. Mitchell maintained professional standards through leadership that balanced firmness with understanding. He recognized that drivers were as exhausted as he was, that everyone was doing their best under impossible conditions, that losing his temper would not improve traffic flow. His control point earned a reputation for efficiency that drew favorable notice from superiors who assigned additional responsibilities and, eventually, promotion. These individual stories of competence and dedication accumulated into systemic effectiveness that German intelligence struggled to credit. Reports from the front described Allied units maintaining offensive pressure week after week without the logistical pauses that German doctrine considered inevitable. Artillery fired ammunition at rates suggesting unlimited supply. Tanks maneuvered aggressively without apparent concern for fuel conservation. Infantry enjoyed regular hot meals and adequate medical support despite operating hundreds of miles from major ports. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, later wrote that German commanders initially attributed Allied logistics success to captured supplies or short-term stockpile expenditure that could not be sustained. When operations continued through September and into October without visible degradation, German staff officers began to accept that their pre-war logistics calculations had fundamentally underestimated American capabilities. The realization came too late to affect German strategy, but it influenced post-war analysis of why the Wehrmacht lost. The Market Garden operation provided the clearest test of whether Red Ball logistics could support the kind of rapid exploitation Montgomery envisioned. The plan required XXX Corps to advance 64 miles from the Belgian border to Arnhem in 2 to 3 days, linking up with airborne forces holding bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. Success depended on maintaining momentum despite operating along a single highway vulnerable to German counterattack. Logistics needed to sustain this thrust without the careful preparation that British doctrine normally required for major operations. Red Ball Express reconfigured its operations to support this requirement. Trucks carrying supplies for British Second Army received absolute priority on all routes. American units temporarily accepted reduced allocations to ensure Montgomery's forces lacked nothing. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, all flowed toward British concentration areas in quantities that exceeded Market Garden planning estimates. The stockpiling demonstrated Red Ball's flexibility in redirecting resources to meet evolving operational priorities. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Horrocks commanded XXX Corps' lead armored division. His units crossed the Belgian-Dutch border on September 17 with fuel tanks full and supply trucks loaded. The initial advance proceeded smoothly until German resistance stiffened around Nijmegen. The single-road approach that concerned planners before the operation proved as vulnerable as feared. German attacks against the extended corridor disrupted supply flow, creating exactly the logistics crisis that Red Ball had been designed to prevent. Yet the system adapted even to this challenge. Red Ball trucks continued delivering supplies to forward dumps despite German interdiction efforts. When the main highway became too dangerous, convoys used secondary roads that German planners had dismissed as inadequate for military traffic. When those routes closed, supplies came forward on smaller vehicles and multiple trips that sacrificed efficiency for persistence. The tonnage reaching XXX Corps decreased from optimal levels but never fell below the minimum required to sustain operations. Market Garden ultimately failed for tactical and operational reasons unrelated to logistics. The bridge at Arnhem proved too heavily defended, German reinforcements arrived faster than Allied intelligence anticipated, weather prevented adequate air support, and the entire plan's assumptions about German weakness proved overly optimistic. But logistics did not cause the failure. XXX Corps fought with adequate supplies throughout the operation. The Red Ball system delivered everything Montgomery's plan required. The plan itself could not achieve its objectives, but that represented strategic miscalculation rather than logistical inadequacy. German officers analyzing the operation afterward recognized this distinction. Market Garden failed, but not because Allied logistics collapsed as German pre-war studies predicted. General Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding German forces that defeated the operation, noted in his report to OKW that Allied supply operations continued functioning effectively even under German counterattack. This observation contradicted German doctrine's assumption that extended supply lines became decisively vulnerable to interdiction. The Allies demonstrated that sufficient resources devoted to logistics could maintain supply flow even through contested territory. The Red Ball Express began winding down in November 1944 as improving railroad service and captured port facilities reduced dependence on truck transport. The Port of Antwerp opened to Allied shipping on November 28 after extensive mine-clearing operations in the Scheldt estuary. Rail lines rebuilt by Allied engineers reached forward areas, providing more efficient cargo movement than trucks. The crisis that birthed Red Ball had passed, though the lessons learned would influence American logistics planning for decades. Final statistics revealed the operation's scale. Red Ball trucks traveled over 500,000 miles during the 81 days of peak operations. They consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel daily just moving themselves, not counting the cargo they delivered. Maintenance crews replaced over 8,000 engines, 15,000 transmissions, and 60,000 tires. Over 140 trucks were damaged beyond economical repair and scrapped. The monetary cost in vehicles, parts, fuel, and labor exceeded $200 million in 1944 dollars. Yet measured against its contribution to ending the war in Europe, Red Ball represented perhaps the most cost-effective logistics operation in military history. The supplies it delivered enabled Allied armies to maintain pressure on German forces throughout the critical autumn months when Wehrmacht resistance might otherwise have solidified. The bridgehead across the Rhine achieved in March 1945 depended on the momentum built during the late summer advance that Red Ball sustained. German plans to trade space for time, establishing successive defensive lines that would prolong the war into 1946 or beyond, collapsed when Red Ball kept Allied spearheads supplied far from their coastal bases. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.